Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Wayne Watt's World History class. Today, I'm going to cover the essay that I wrote for Core World Key Standard 6.3. In addition, for AP World History, this is Unit 8 Decolonization stuff. So, in 1648, the Peace of Westphalia brought an end to the 30 Years' War in Europe, ending their devastating wars over religion, primarily Protestantism versus Catholicism. The treaty ended up creating the modern nation state system. Instead of simply assuming that a universal Christian theocracy would govern the entire world, the Peace of Westphalia system allowed for the notion of foreign sovereignty and created an idea that states should be based upon national communities, something like language or something like that. These newly imagined national communities could be based upon language, ethnicity, or other notions, and those commonalities began to strive to have their own independent nation states, hence nationalism. Nationalism emerged as a major international issue, especially as the age of imperialism in the Progressive Era and eventually was the most important cause of World War I. The Treaty of Versailles, which brought an end to World War I, did not sufficiently solve the causes of World War I, for example, imperialism, and World War II broke out in the 1930s, in Asia first and then in Europe in 1939. When the United States began to get more fully involved in the war, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill created the Atlantic Charter in 1941. In it, Roosevelt included a section recognizing the right of all people to choose the form of government under which they live. Again, one of the main ideas underlying Enlightenment philosophy from earlier in the course, paving the way for decolonization after World War II got over. World War II ended up being the most destructive war in human history and radically reshaped political structures all around the globe. When the war ended in 1945, the victorious parties helped to create the United Nations, which hoped to bring about a peaceful world going forward in the 20th century. With the creation of this organization, the United States of America, among other states, tried to solve the issue of imperialism by taking a position against colonialism. As a consequence, between 1945 and the present, dozens of new states have been created, especially in Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Many of these new state structures were created as a consequence of negotiating with former colonial powers, but others were only created as a result of fighting revolutionary wars. This begs the question then, how does one know whether to negotiate against colonialism or when to fight against it? How could colonized people know whether they ought to rebel when imperial states were slow to give up colonial control or whether to continue negotiating to achieve independence? Whenever possible, my argument would be people ought to use nonviolence to obtain their independence from colonial powers. But this is not always possible, and sometimes violence is justified, as can be seen in the cases of Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Decolonization from 1945 to the present has had a massive impact on the state structures of Africa. These changes included both peaceful negotiations as well as violent revolutions against imperial structures. In Ghana, peaceful protests erupted into violent resistance after the British opened fire on a group of veterans from World War II who were protesting in 1948. After years of negotiation, the British recognized the independence of what had been the colony of the Gold Coast and recognized this guy, Kwame Nkrumah, as the prime minister in 1957. Nkrumah, reflecting on the process of decolonization, suggested that colonialism was only ever for the economic benefit of the imperial power and not for the benefit of the colony. In addition to Ghana, Nigeria also negotiated independence from the British, obtaining it in 1960. Perhaps the best example of nonviolence working in Africa is South Africa. South Africa first gained its independence from Great Britain in 1910, changing to the South African Republic in 1961, Lesotho and Swaziland becoming independent in 1966 and 1968, respectively. As early as 1948, white settlers in South Africa had passed a series of laws with the intent of preventing black people from obtaining political power known as apartheid. Most of the land in South Africa was granted to white people, and dark skinned people were gathered into clusters that were known as Bantustans. In opposition to this system, South Africans created the African National Congress, which gained new members like Nelson Mandela, who urged opposition to this system. In 1955, the ANC issued out what's known as its Freedom Charter. It declared that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and that no government can justify to claim authority unless it is based on the will of all of the people. Black South Africans continued to protest against the unjust regime, escalating in 1960, which led to the notorious Sharpeville massacre. After Sharpeville, many South Africans began to believe that violence was more appropriate, including Nelson Mandela. Mandela and other leaders of the ANC were arrested and sentenced to life in prison as a consequence of a terrorist attack that they engaged in. While in jail, Nelson Mandela became an international symbol of the oppression that black South African people were facing. Early on, he wrote that black South Africans should use violence to resist the apartheid regime. But as he sat in jail, he began to change his mind. Mandela came to believe and later advocate that it would be possible to overturn the regime through nonviolent methods, like those that were used by Gandhi in South Asia. Internationally, students, Black consciousness believers, and others protested and boycotted the apartheid regime. The boycott was much more effective than some of the earlier, more violent movements, and Nelson Mandela was released from jail in 1989. In 1989, F.W. de Klerk was elected, this guy right here, and he legalized the ANC and began the process of ending apartheid. Mandela ran for president and was overwhelmingly elected in 1994. And when he was elected, he spoke about how he had fought for equality and was even willing to die so that people could have equal opportunities. From Mandela's perspective, freedom for the people of South Africa really never came until 1994, when universal suffrage allowed for black South Africans to vote. South Africa shows the fact that nonviolence can sometimes even work better than violence at overturning colonization. The experience of French West Africa, which was largely similar to that of British West Africa, the French had been humiliated in the Second World War, and the expense of trying to keep control of Algeria and Indochina led the French to engage in negotiations with West Africans who wanted independence. And so, for the most part, these West African states ended up negotiating with France to gain independence. Negotiations between the French and African leaders like Leopold Sedar Senghor and Felix Houphouët-Boigny led to the creation of new states like the Ivory Coast or Cote d'Ivoire in 1960 and Senegal. In the same year, the United Nations Declaration Against Colonialism decried subjugation, domination, and exploitation, suggesting that it was even contrary to the UN Charter. A wave of newly independent states erupted all across West Africa as state after state emerged from the French Empire. Gabon, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Niger, Burkina Faso, and so on. The Belgians abandoned their colony in the Congo in 1960 as well. There were few educated Congolese in contrast to some of the other African nations because the Belgians intended for that to be the case. In 1960, there were only 16 college graduates out of a population of 13 million people in the Congo. There was, therefore, not much of a nationalist movement forcing the Belgians out. Thus, by 1960, most of West Africa had successfully negotiated for their independence from European imperialist powers. In Africa, decolonization through negotiation and nonviolence was sometimes successful. In contrast, other areas of Africa, especially where there were settler colonies, only gained independence as a result of violence and revolutionary warfare. And this is definitely the case in Algeria, in Angola, and in Kenya. Areas that had been settler colonies proved to be much more difficult when it came to decolonization because the Europeans who had migrated there enjoyed a privileged status. The most obvious examples are Algeria and Kenya. In 1954, the same year that the French forces were defeated at Dien Bien Phu, the French engaged in a bloody war to try to maintain control of Algeria, a war that they lost in 1962. The French had come to believe that Algeria was an essential part of France and not just a colony, and looked at the conflict there as a chance to restore some of the national status after the humiliation of World War II and the loss in Vietnam. The Arab and Berber populations of Algeria were organized under the National Liberation Front, and the settlers were organized under the Secret Army Organization. The Secret Army Organization engaged in violence not only against the Arab and Berber populations of Algeria, but also against those settlers who advocated for independence of the North African territory. In 1958, the group was even successful at overturning the French Fourth Republic. At one point, they even tried to assassinate Charles de Gaulle. The French public eventually tired of the seemingly endless war, and Algeria gained its independence in 1962. British settlers in the colony that we now call Kenya resisted decolonization and fought to keep their privileged position despite British opposition to colonialism. Jomo Kenyatta began to promote a nonviolent approach to ending colonialism in the 1950s, but was largely unsuccessful. Frustrated with the lack of progress, a more radical group called the Kenya African Union began to engage in guerrilla warfare against the British settlers. The British settlers, accusing the other sides of barbarism, labeled the movement the Mau Mau Rebellion to make it sound barbaric. In response to the guerrilla attacks, the British settlers put Jomo Kenyatta and other leaders of the movement into jail, eliminating the nonviolent part of the movement for independence. After years of fighting the natives and after thousands of people were killed, the British released Kenyatta from prison and negotiated with the nationalists. Kenyatta emerged as the leading spokesperson for the nationalists, and a new government was created in 1963 that allowed for multiracial participation in the government. When he became the president in 1964, Kenyatta took a somewhat contradictory approach. He spoke of the land as being for the native Kenyans, but used a conciliatory method when speaking to the white settlers. He said that he never approved of violence, but suggested the freedom tree can only grow when you pour blood onto it. Similar violence took place in the context of decolonization in Angola, Mozambique, and southern Rhodesia. With the vast size of Africa, one can see a good number of examples where violence was necessary for peoples to gain independence from colonial powers, and others where violence was not as necessary. In cases like French and British West Africa, negotiation for independence was possible and ended up working out quite well. In the case of South Africa, nonviolence and a boycott were much more effective at overturning colonialization than was violence itself. However, Algeria, Kenya, Angola, and others never would have found independence without engaging in violence. The best option is for people to recognize when they have had a privileged position and realize that equality, especially political equality, is best. As the saying goes, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality often feels like oppression. In the 14th century, Tamerlane led, moving on to South Asia, Tamerlane led one of the most crushing series of conquests in the history of the world. From Central Asia through modern Pakistan and India, Timur created a massive empire, and his successors crafted what we know as the Mongol or the Mughal dynasty in India. When the British first started getting a foothold in India in the early modern era, the Hindu population largely welcomed the British, who were seen as liberators from the Mughals. By the 19th century, however, the British had begun to be viewed as oppressors, and their lack of appreciation for the culture of the Indians led to what we like to call the Sepoy Mutiny, or more often now, the Indian Mutiny of 1857. The British had new gun cartridges, and they had been brought to India. The casings were rumored to be covered in animal fat, which was offensive to both Indian and Hindu people and Muslim people. The mutiny evolved into a war against the British, and dreadful things happened on both sides. From 1857 on, the Indians began to seek independence from the British. In 1885, the Indians formed the Indian National Congress, which negotiated for cooperation with and then independence from the British Empire. When World War I broke out, the British promised the Indians independence if they would support their side in the war. The Indians agreed and sent large numbers of troops to the Western Front to aid the British. Intractable problems between Hindu people and the Muslim minority of India turned out to be too difficult to solve, however, leaving the British in a position of negotiating in the interwar period. By the time that World War II emerged, India still had not successfully negotiated for its independence. The most important person in organizing the Indian people to pressure the British to decolonize was this guy, Mohandas Gandhi. Gandhi had lived in South Africa and had seen the intense racial discrimination that was present in that country and was devoted to eliminating that type of discrimination in India. Gandhi returned to India in 1915, having acquired a law degree, and became an important leader in the Indian National Congress. As a leader of the Congress, Gandhi encouraged the Indians to boycott British made goods and produce their own instead. The boycott was inspirational to many Indians, and many began to see it as a method to gain freedom from British rule. Gandhi encouraged nonviolent resistance to British control. In his writings, he said passive resistance is a method of securing rights by personal suffering. It is the reverse of resistance by arms. In 1930, Gandhi led what we like to call the Salt March to the sea to protest the British monopoly on salt production. His health was deteriorating, but he famously shook the foundations of the British Empire by making it to the sea and picking up a bit of salt, which was against the law. On March 5th, 1931, the British relented, passing the Gandhi-Irwin Act, which legalized coastal Indians collecting their own salt. Negotiations continued through the 1930s, culminating in the Government of India Act in 1937. The act created a government for the Indians and a great deal of self-rule from the British Empire. However, complications from the Great Depression led to intense disagreement in India, especially as the imperial British government did little to help agricultural communities. In addition, the intractable religious divide between Hindu and Muslim people persisted. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, head of the Muslim League, pointed out that the millions of Muslim people in a unified state would largely have their will drowned out in a democracy like what was being proposed. When Britain was dragged into World War II in 1939, they again asked India to support them, and Britain would again facilitate their move to independence. After World War II ended in 1945, the British held up to their promise, regrettably resulting in a disaster, approximately 1 million people killed. In a concession to Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the Muslim League, the British agreed to independence of India as two separate states, India on the one hand and Pakistan on the other. In the aftermath, around 10 million people moved, mostly Hindu people leaving the newly created state of Pakistan, moving to India, and Muslim people leaving India and going to Pakistan. In the process, about 1 million people were killed in the violence as people passed each other. Gandhi spoke out against the violence, and in 1948, he was assassinated by a Hindu extremist named Nathuram Godse, who shot Gandhi at an evening prayer meeting. Jawaharlal Nehru became the new leader of India. Independence was very difficult for South Asia to achieve, but it shows another example where nonviolent resistance to imperial colonialism actually can result in autonomy. Like in South Africa, a boycott can actually be effective at ending colonial control. Next is Southeast Asia. People in Southeast Asia have been fighting against foreign imperialism for thousands of years. In the time of Jesus, the Vietnamese fought a war against the Chinese, during which the Trung sisters fought the Chinese on the back of elephants. The Chinese ruled the Red River Valley until 938 CE Common Era, when the Vietnamese forces defeated the Chinese at the Battle of Bac Dang River. From then, the state of Champa, in what is currently Vietnam, was forced to deal with the tribute system that China had, famously transferring Champa rice to the Chinese, which led to a doubling of the Chinese population inside the Song dynasty that can be seen here. Of course, afterwards will come the devastation as a consequence of the invasion of the Mongols. After that, the Vietnamese dealt with the Mongol invasions and then were colonized by the French. The French held Indochina for years until the Japanese took it away from them during World War II. After World War II ended in 1945, Ho Chi Minh wrote a Declaration of Independence that was modeled on the U.S. Declaration of Independence. In it, Ho Chi Minh declared that the Vietnamese were willing to fight to the bitter end against the French trying to control their territory. The French, resentful of their defeat by the Germans, sought to restore their world power status by keeping control of Indochina and Algeria. The United States of America sent troops into Vietnam in 1945 underneath Truman, the first president to send U.S. troops to Vietnam. The U.S. was trying to disarm the remaining Japanese soldiers that were in the country, but of course it ended in an awkward situation. Officially, since Franklin Roosevelt, the U.S. was in a position of being opposed to colonialism, but had troops in a country that France was trying to keep as a colony. Additionally, the North Vietnamese and Ho Chi Minh's embrace of communism made the situation obdurate. The Vietnamese engaged in guerrilla attacks against the French, attacking and then blending in with the civilian population when the French troops tried to counterattack. Finally, in 1954, the Vietnamese surrendered the remaining troops at Dien Bien Phu, and the French surrendered. The U.S. found itself alone in supporting a very unpopular government in South Vietnam. The U.S. had dedicated itself to preventing the spread of communism, and North Vietnam was threatening to spread the ideology south. This led the U.S. into supporting what was a very unpopular government led by Ngo Dinh Diem. The U.S. and Diem had held what were called rigged elections in 1950, but the communists were not allowed to participate in the election. The North Vietnamese and the U.S. both escalated their military operations in South Vietnam. By 1968, the U.S. had hundreds of thousands of soldiers in Vietnam, which proved problematic because many Vietnamese viewed the U.S. as just the next imperial presence. Despite the losses of almost 60,000 U.S. personnel, the U.S. was not able to defeat the communist movement. In 1973, the U.S. withdrew most of its combat troops, and without that support, South Vietnam was overrun by North Vietnam in 1975. Despite the years that Vietnam had spent fighting for what many of its people viewed as freedom from colonialism, they again had to fight a foreign presence as China in 1979 sought greater influence in the region, and Vietnam fought against China even then for years more. So, in conclusion, decolonization shows in depth some of the biggest issues in human history. How should our states be structured? When is violence appropriate? When is violence not appropriate? Empires throughout history have been shown to be problematic, especially when they fail to provide for the prosperity of their peoples, justice, equality, and liberty, and those types of things. When intractable differences have created problems between their different populations, empires have often failed to sufficiently deal with those issues. It is clear that ruling over diverse peoples is difficult, and this is especially true when it comes to far off cores and far flung peripheries of imperial states. Many lessons can be drawn from the experiences of decolonization. White supremacist social structures are not just and ought to be rejected. All people ought to have a right to their national self determination, and people shouldn't be destined to lower class because of the color of their skin. Notions about social Darwinism that were popular in the progressive era were wrong. The mistreatment of colonial peoples was wrong. In terms of violence, it is clear that nonviolent resistance to oppression and colonialism can work. In fact, in some cases, it seems like it actually works better than violence. So, for example, in South Africa, when possible, it is clear that resisting oppression through a boycott is one of the best solutions. It seems to work quite well to hit a state structure in the wallet, which is what Gandhi had in mind when he was making his own clothing. The number of other examples where this would not work seems to provide a powerful counterpoint. In Vietnam, Algeria, Angola, and many others, independence would never have come had it not been for violence. States need to restrict their greed for colonies. People globally have a right to freely choose their own governments, and failure to provide them with these rights eventually leaves them with few options. So, the formatting, getting my bibliography to the PowerPoint has messed it up a few places. See the essay for better formatting. But here are the works cited: primary sources cited here, secondary sources cited here, and the footnotes if you'd like to track on a basis by basis claim where I'm getting them from. You can see so here in the footnotes. That's it for today. Thank you.